I came home from a week-long consulting job in Dallas to find my 40-acre ranch transformed into what looked like a high-society wedding venue, complete with white tents, valet parking, and a woman in a designer gown directing caterers across my front pasture like she owned the place. That woman was Melody Thornfield, our HOA president, who apparently decided my property was the perfect location for her annual charity gala while I was away. But what she didn't know was that I wasn't just some quiet rancher she could bulldoze. I was a retired ATF investigator who'd spent 20 years dismantling criminal organizations, and I was about to give her a masterclass in what happens when you mess with the wrong man's land. The sight that greeted me as I turned into my driveway on that warm September evening should have been impossible. My ranch gate, which I'd left locked with a heavy chain, stood wide open with a decorative archway spanning the entrance. Elegant script lettering proclaimed, "Welcome to the Autumn Harvest Gala, supporting local youth programs." A professional valet in a red vest waved me toward a makeshift parking area that had been carved out of my east pasture, where luxury cars sat in neat rows like some country club event. I parked my dusty F-150 at the edge of the chaos and stepped out. Still wearing my travel clothes and boots from the Dallas job, the transformation was surreal. My simple ranch house, a modest two-story structure I'd inherited from my grandfather, had been draped in flowing fabric and strung with thousands of twinkling lights. The wraparound porch where I usually drank my morning coffee now hosted an elaborate buffet station, while my fire pit area had been converted into a champagne bar complete with ice sculptures. But it was the woman orchestrating this circus that really caught my attention. Melody Thornfield stood in the center of my front yard, wearing a flowing emerald gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, gesturing dramatically with a clipboard while shouting orders at a small army of caterers and decorators. At 52, Melody had the kind of manufactured elegance that came from expensive salons and personal trainers. Her platinum blonde hair styled in an elaborate updo, and her makeup applied with professional precision. I'd had run-ins with Melody before. As president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA, she'd made a career out of micromanaging every aspect of our small community, issuing citations for grass that grew a quarter-inch too long and demanding residents seek approval for everything from mailbox colors to outdoor Christmas decorations. But this was a new level of audacity, even for her. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached her position near what used to be my vegetable garden, now occupied by a string quartet. "What exactly is happening on my property?" Melody turned toward me with the kind of practiced smile she reserved for people she considered beneath her station. "Oh, Jack, you're back early from your little business trip. Don't worry about all this. We'll have everything cleaned up by midnight. The gala is going splendidly, and we've already raised over $30,000 for the youth programs." The casual way she dismissed my concern, combined with her assumption that I'd simply accept this invasion of my privacy, sent a familiar surge of investigative instinct through my system. During my years with the ATF, I'd learned to recognize the signs of someone who believed they were above consequences, and Melody Thornfield was displaying every one of them. "Melody, you're hosting an event on my property without my permission," I said, keeping my voice level and professional. "I need you to shut this down immediately and get everyone off my land." Her laugh was like crystal breaking, sharp and artificial. "Oh, Jack, don't be such a spoilsport. The HOA board voted unanimously to designate your ranch as this year's gala venue. It's all perfectly legal under our Community Enhancement Clause. Besides, think of the children who will benefit from tonight's fundraising." That was when I noticed the photographer crouched near my barn, capturing artistic shots of guests posed against the rustic backdrop of my property. A professional videographer swept past with a camera rig, documenting the event for what I assumed was some kind of promotional material. This wasn't just trespassing, it was a full-scale commercial operation being conducted on my land without my knowledge or consent. What community enhancement clause? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. And when exactly did this board vote take place? Melody's smile flickered for just a moment, revealing something calculating beneath the polished surface. Well, you haven't been attending our meetings lately. Jack, we can't hold up community progress just because one resident chooses not to participate in local governance. The clause allows the board to utilize underutilized community assets for the betterment of the neighborhood. The phrase underutilized community assets hit me like a physical blow. In her mind, my ranch, the property my family had owned for 3 generations, had somehow become a community resource she could commandeer at will. It was exactly the kind of bureaucratic overreach I'd spent 2 decades fighting in federal law enforcement. Dressed up in the language of civic duty and charitable causes, "Show me the documentation," I said, extending my hand. "I want to see the board vote, the community enhancement clause, and whatever legal authority you think gives you the right to use my property." For the first time since I'd arrived, Melody's composure showed cracks. She clutched her clipboard tighter and took a small step backward. "I don't carry all the paperwork with me to social events. Jack, you can review the minutes at the next board meeting. Tonight is about raising money for disadvantaged youth, and I won't let your selfishness derail such an important cause." The deflection confirmed my suspicions. During my ATF career, I'd interviewed hundreds of people who tried to hide criminal activity behind claims of noble intentions. The pattern was always the same. When pressed for specifics, they'd attack the questioner's character and wrap themselves in the flag of some greater good. Melody was following the script perfectly. I pulled out my phone and began recording. "For the record, Melody, you're currently trespassing on private property, along with approximately 200 other people. I'm giving you 30 minutes to end this event and remove everyone from my land." The transformation in her demeanor was instant and dramatic. The practiced smile vanished, replaced by a cold fury that turned her face into a mask of barely controlled rage. "You wouldn't dare," she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Do you have any idea how important this gala is? The mayor is here, along with the city council and half the county commissioners. If you try to shut this down, you'll be blacklisted from every social and business circle in this region." Her threat revealed more than she probably intended. This wasn't just about unauthorized use of my property. It was about establishing her power and influence in front of an audience of local political figures. By successfully commandeering my ranch for her gala, Melody was demonstrating that she could override individual property rights when it served her purposes. It was a power play disguised as charity work. 29 minutes, I said, checking my watch. "I suggest you start making announcements." Instead of complying, Melody did something that shifted this confrontation into an entirely different category. She pulled out her own phone and dialed a number, speaking loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Sheriff's Department? Yes. I need to report a disturbed individual who's threatening to disrupt a charity event. He appears to be intoxicated and possibly armed." The false police report was a criminal act, and she'd just committed it in front of multiple witnesses while I was recording. My years of investigative experience kicked into overdrive as I recognized this as the moment when Melody Thornfield crossed the line from obnoxious HOA president to actual criminal. She just handed me the evidence I needed to destroy her. But first I had to deal with the immediate situation. I stopped recording and immediately called the county sheriff's office myself. "This is Jack Morrison at 1247 Willowbrook Ranch Road. I'm a retired federal agent, and I have a trespassing situation involving approximately 200 people on my private property. The person who organized this event just filed a false police report claiming I'm intoxicated and armed. I'm standing in my front yard, completely sober, recording the entire interaction." The dispatcher's tone shifted when I mentioned my federal background. "Agent Morrison, we have units en route. Please remain on the line and maintain a safe distance from the trespassers. Within minutes, I could see flashing lights approaching down the long gravel road that led to my ranch. But Melody wasn't finished escalating the situation. As the first sheriff's vehicle pulled through my gate, she positioned herself between me and the approaching deputy. Her arms spread wide in a theatrical gesture of protection. "Officer, thank God you're here," she called out as Deputy Rodriguez stepped out of his patrol car. "This man has been drinking and making threats about disrupting our charity event. We're trying to raise money for underprivileged children, and he's creating a dangerous situation." Deputy Rodriguez, a professional I'd worked with during several federal task force operations, looked from Melody to me with the careful expression of someone trying to assess a complex situation. "Agent Morrison, what's going on here?" "Good evening, Carlos," I said, using his first name to establish our professional relationship. "I came home from a business trip to find my property had been converted into an event venue without my permission. When I asked the organizer to shut it down, she filed a false police report claiming I was intoxicated and armed. I handed him my phone with the recording, still queued up. Everything's documented, including her admission that the HOA board supposedly voted to designate my ranch as a community asset they could use without my consent." Carlos listened to the key portions of the recording, his expression growing increasingly serious as Melody's threats and false accusations played back in clear audio. When he looked up, his professional demeanor had shifted into something much more formal. "Ma'am, I need to see the legal documentation that gives you authority to use this property," he said to Melody, "and I need to understand why you reported the property owner as intoxicated when he's clearly sober." The panic that flashed across Melody's face was immediately replaced by indignant outrage. "I don't appreciate your tone. Officer, I'm a respected member of this community, and I was trying to protect a charitable event from disruption. Perhaps you should focus on the real problem here instead of harassing a woman who's trying to help disadvantaged children." It was a masterful deflection attempt, but Carlos Rodriguez had been a cop for 15 years and had dealt with entitled residents before. "Ma'am, I need to see the documentation, or I'm going to have to ask you to shut down this event immediately." "Fine," Melody snapped, pulling out her phone. "I'll call our attorney. He'll explain the legal authority we have under community enhancement provisions." She dialed a number and launched into a rapid explanation of the situation, her voice carrying clearly across the decorated yard. "Richard, it's Melody. I need you to explain to a sheriff's deputy that our community enhancement clause gives us the authority to utilize Jack Morrison's ranch for the gala. Yes, he's being difficult about it. And now the police are here threatening to shut down our fundraiser." I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I watched Melody's expression change from confident to confused to alarmed as whoever she was speaking with apparently explained something she didn't want to hear. "What do you mean there's no such clause?" she said, her voice rising. "You drafted the HOA documents yourself. Surely there's some provision for community benefit projects." The silence that followed was telling, even from several feet away. I could see the color draining from Melody's face as the reality of her situation began to sink in. She'd built this entire elaborate scheme on a legal authority that didn't exist. And now, she was facing the consequences, in front of 200 guests and a sheriff's deputy who was rapidly losing patience with her evasions. "Richard, you need to get down here immediately," she said, her composure finally cracking. "I don't care if you're at your daughter's recital. This is a crisis." She hung up and turned back to Deputy Rodriguez with desperation creeping into her voice. "Our attorney is on his way to sort this out. Surely we can resolve this misunderstanding without disrupting a charity event that's raising money for needy children." Carlos looked at me with the expression of a professional seeking guidance from a colleague. "Agent Morrison, what would you like me to do here?" The question hung in the evening air as the string quartet continued playing and guests mingled around my property. most of them unaware that the foundation of their elegant charity gala was crumbling in real time. I had several options, ranging from having everyone arrested for trespassing to allowing the event to continue while pursuing civil remedies later. But my years in federal law enforcement had taught me that sometimes the most effective justice comes from letting criminals dig their own graves. "Give me 5 minutes to address the crowd," I said. "I think these people deserve to know the truth about what they're participating in." Melody's eyes widened in horror. "You can't seriously be considering embarrassing me in front of the entire community leadership. These are influential people. Jack, destroying my reputation will have consequences for both of us." The threat was as obvious as it was desperate. Melody was essentially admitting that her entire power structure was built on maintaining appearances, and that exposing her lies would bring down everything she'd worked to build. It was exactly the kind of moment I'd learned to recognize in my federal career, the point where a subject realizes they're caught and tries to negotiate from a position of weakness. "You should have thought about consequences before you decided to host an unauthorized event on my property," I replied. "Carlos, I'd like to make a brief announcement to the guests before we proceed with removing them from my land." Deputy Rodriguez nodded and activated his radio to call for additional units. Anticipating that removing 200 people from a formal event might require some crowd control assistance. Meanwhile, I walked toward the makeshift stage area where the string quartet was performing. With Melody trailing behind me, making increasingly frantic phone calls, the musicians stopped playing as I approached, and conversations throughout the yard gradually died down. As guests noticed the presence of law enforcement, I could see Mayor Patricia Hendricks near the champagne bar, along with several city council members and other local officials that Melody had clearly invited to witness her demonstration of power and influence. "Ladies and gentlemen," I called out, my voice carrying the authority that comes from years of addressing hostile audiences, "I'm Jack Morrison, and this is my ranch. I need to inform you that tonight's event is taking place on my property without my permission or knowledge." The gasps and murmurs that rippled through the crowd confirmed that most of the guests had assumed this was a legitimate, authorized event. I could see people pulling out their phones to record as the situation took an unexpected turn toward drama. "I was told by the HOA president that your board voted to designate my ranch as a community asset that could be used for events like this," I continued. "However, the HOA attorney has just confirmed that no such authority exists, which means everyone here is currently trespassing on private property." The reaction was immediate and electric. Conversations erupted throughout the crowd as people processed the implications of what I just revealed. Mayor Hendricks pushed through the crowd toward the stage area, her face flushed with what appeared to be both embarrassment and anger. "Melody, what is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the growing chaos. "You assured the city council that you had proper authorization to use this venue." But Melody was no longer focused on damage control. Instead, she was staring at her phone with an expression of complete devastation. "Richard won't take my calls," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He says the firm is dropping me as a client effective immediately." The attorney's abandonment was the final domino in Melody's elaborate scheme. Without legal backing for her community enhancement claims, facing a crowd of influential people who now knew they'd been deceived, and confronted with potential criminal charges for filing a false police report, her entire power structure was collapsing in real time. "I need everyone to begin making their way to the exits," Deputy Rodriguez announced, his voice professionally calm, but carrying unmistakable authority. "This property is privately owned, and the owner has not authorized tonight's event. Please collect your belongings and proceed to your vehicles in an orderly fashion." The evacuation of my ranch took nearly an hour, with guests streaming toward the valet parking area in various states of confusion, embarrassment, and anger. I watched from my front porch as the elaborate decorations came down and the catering equipment was loaded into trucks, transforming my property back into the quiet ranch it was supposed to be, but the most interesting part of the evening was watching Melody's complete psychological breakdown as her carefully constructed world imploded around her. She stood in the middle of my front yard, still wearing her emerald gown, making increasingly desperate phone calls to people who were clearly refusing to take her calls. "Patricia, please, you have to understand," I heard her saying to the mayor's voicemail. This was all a misunderstanding. Jack Morrison has always been difficult about community cooperation, and I was just trying to do something wonderful for the children. The deflection and blame shifting continued as she left similar messages for city council members, county commissioners, and what sounded like major donors who had supported the gala. But her reputation in the community was finished, and everyone involved now knew that Melody Thornfield was willing to commit criminal acts to maintain her illusion of power and influence. As the last of the guests departed, and the catering crews finished their cleanup, Deputy Rodriguez approached me with the satisfied expression of someone who just witnessed justice being served. "Agent Morrison, would you like to press charges for the false police report?" I considered the question carefully. Melody was standing 50 feet away, looking lost and defeated in her expensive gown, holding a phone that no one would answer. Her HOA presidency was finished. Her legal troubles were just beginning, and her reputation in the community was destroyed beyond repair. Sometimes the most effective punishment is simply allowing someone to face the full consequences of their actions. "Let's start with a formal report documenting tonight's events," I said. "The false police report is on record, and I have everything recorded. If she continues to harass me or my property, we can revisit criminal charges." Carlos nodded and began taking my statement. While Melody finally seemed to understand that her evening of triumph had become a complete disaster, she gathered up her clipboard and purse and walked toward the parking area where her Mercedes was waiting. Her head held high, but her entire power structure lying in ruins behind her. The next morning brought a steady stream of visitors to my ranch, though these were very different from the previous evening's unwelcome guests. First came my neighbor, elderly Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the small house adjacent to my property. She arrived carrying a casserole dish and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "Jack, I have to tell you what happened after you left the HOA meeting last month," she said, settling into one of my porch chairs with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting weeks to share gossip. "Melody told everyone that you'd agreed to host the gala here, and that you were just being modest about it. She said you'd specifically requested that all the arrangements be handled while you were out of town, so you wouldn't have to deal with the social obligations." The revelation confirmed what I'd suspected. Melody's scheme wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision, but a carefully planned deception that she'd been building for weeks. She'd apparently told the HOA board, the city officials, and the guests themselves that I was a willing participant who preferred to remain in the background. "Did anyone question her about authorization?" I asked. Mrs. Patterson nodded vigorously. "Bill Hendricks, that's the mayor's husband, asked to see the written agreement. Melody told him all the paperwork was confidential due to your privacy concerns, but that everything had been properly filed with the HOA attorney." The pattern of lies was becoming clear. Melody had constructed an elaborate deception that relied on people's reluctance to question someone in authority, combined with plausible explanations for why documentation couldn't be provided immediately. It was a sophisticated fraud that might have succeeded if I hadn't returned early from Dallas. My second visitor that morning was more official. Detective Sarah Chen from the county sheriff's office arrived just as Mrs. Patterson was leaving, carrying a thick folder that suggested this was more than a routine follow-up visit. "Agent Morrison, I'm investigating last night's incident, and I've discovered some additional information that you should be aware of," she said, taking a seat at my kitchen table. "Melody Thornfield has been using her HOA position to conduct what appears to be a systematic fraud operation." She opened her folder and spread out several documents, including bank statements, vendor contracts, and what appeared to be forged authorization letters. We've been tracking complaints about unauthorized HOA fees and fake community improvement projects for the past 6 months. Last night's gala appears to be the largest scheme she's attempted. But it's not the first. The documents painted a picture of a woman who'd gradually escalated from minor HOA overreach to significant financial fraud. Melody had been collecting fees for non-existent community improvements, authorizing expenditures for personal benefits, and using her position to secure discounts from vendors who believed they were working on official HOA projects. The gala itself cost approximately $45,000. Detective Chen continued, the caterers, decorators, musicians, and venue services were all contracted under the HOA's name, with Melody claiming the organization had a special arrangement with a private property owner. Most of the vendors are now demanding payment from the HOA, which doesn't have anything close to $45,000 in its accounts. The financial implications were staggering. Melody had essentially bankrupted the Homeowners Association to fund her ego project, leaving the organization unable to pay its legitimate expenses while creating massive liability for services she'd contracted without authorization. What about the charity component? I asked. She claimed they'd raised $30,000 for youth programs. Detective Chen's expression darkened. That's the most disturbing part. The youth charity she claimed to be supporting doesn't exist. She created fake promotional materials and donation receipts, but all the money went into an account she controlled personally. We're estimating that she collected nearly $28,000 from guests who believed they were supporting disadvantaged children. The scope of Melody's deception was breathtaking. She hadn't just trespassed on my property and filed a false police report. She'd defrauded an entire community of respected citizens while claiming to help children. It was the kind of multi-layered criminal scheme that would result in serious federal charges if it had crossed state lines. Detective, I want to cooperate fully with your investigation. I said, I have recordings from last night, and I suspect there might be additional evidence on my property if she was using it for planning meetings or storage. Over the next several hours, Detective Chen and I conducted a thorough search of my ranch, looking for any evidence that Melody might have left behind during her event preparation. What we found exceeded our expectations. Hidden behind my barn, we discovered a storage trailer that contained boxes of fake charity materials, forged HOA documents, and financial records that documented the full scope of her fraud operation. Among the most damaging evidence was a handwritten notebook that appeared to be Melody's personal planning journal for the gala. The entries revealed her complete awareness that she had no legal authority to use my property, along with detailed strategies for deflecting questions and maintaining the deception until the event was concluded. Jack's out of town until Friday. Read one entry dated 3 weeks earlier. Perfect timing for setup without interference. Will tell vendors he's bashful about recognition. File community enhancement paperwork after the fact. Richard can backdate if necessary. The casual mention of backdating legal documents confirmed that Melody's attorney was potentially complicit in the fraud, though it remained to be seen whether he'd actually participated or if this was simply wishful thinking on Melody's part. By late afternoon, Detective Chen had collected enough evidence to support multiple felony charges against Melody Thornfield, including fraud, embezzlement, filing false police reports, and conspiracy. The investigation was expanding to include potential charges against vendors who might have been aware of the unauthorized nature of the event, as well as any HOA board members who had participated in approving obviously fraudulent expenditures. Agent Morrison, I have to ask, Detective Chen said as we concluded our evidence gathering, your background is in federal law enforcement. Did you suspect something like this was happening before last night? I considered her question carefully. During my years with the ATF, I developed an instinct for recognizing when someone's public persona didn't match their actual capabilities or resources. Melody had always struck me as someone who spent beyond her means and claimed influence she didn't actually possess. but I'd attributed that to typical HOA power tripping rather than criminal fraud. I knew she was overreaching her authority. I admitted, but I assumed it was garden variety nonsense, not systematic criminal activity. If I'd realized the scope of what she was doing, I would have contacted law enforcement months ago. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset over my restored ranch, I reflected on how quickly Melody's elaborate scheme had unraveled once it was exposed to scrutiny. During my federal career, I'd learned that most criminal enterprises collapse rapidly when subjected to professional investigation, but it was still remarkable how thoroughly her reputation and freedom had been destroyed in the span of 24 hours. My phone rang just as the last light was fading from the sky. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice was unmistakably familiar. "Jack, this is Melody," she said, her voice hoarse and strained. "I need to talk to you. There are things you don't understand about last night, and I think we can work something out that benefits everyone." The attempted negotiation was exactly what I'd expected. In my experience, people who'd been caught committing serious crimes often tried to convince their victims that the situation was more complicated than it appeared, hoping to avoid the full consequences of their actions. "Melody, you should be talking to your attorney." "Not to me," I replied. "Detective Chen has already briefed me on the scope of your fraud operation, so I'm fully aware of what you've been doing." "You don't understand?" she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "I was trying to do something wonderful for the community. Yes, maybe I cut some corners with paperwork, but the intent was good. The children's charity is real. I just haven't had time to get all the nonprofit paperwork filed properly." The continued lying, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, confirmed that Melody was incapable of accepting responsibility for her actions. She was still trying to maintain the fiction that her crimes were merely administrative oversights rather than deliberate deception. "Melody, Detective Chen showed me your planning notebook," I said. "You wrote down your strategy for deceiving vendors and guests, including plans to backdate legal documents. This wasn't about helping children. This was about feeding your ego and stealing money from your neighbors." The silence that followed was broken only by what sounded like muffled crying. When Melody spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "My husband filed for divorce this morning," she said. "The bank froze our accounts, and the HOA board voted to remove me from all positions. I've lost everything. Jack, isn't that punishment enough?" The personal consequences of her crimes were severe, but they were the natural result of her choices rather than punishment I had imposed. During my federal career, I'd seen many criminals try to evoke sympathy by highlighting the consequences of their actions while ignoring the harm they'd caused to others. "Melody, you stole nearly $30,000 from people who thought they were helping disadvantaged children," I said. "You bankrupted the homeowners association and destroyed your neighbor's trust. The consequences you're facing are the direct result of your criminal behavior, not some personal vendetta against you." She hung up without responding, and I didn't expect to hear from her again. Within a week, local news outlets were reporting that Melody Thornfield had been arrested on multiple felony charges related to fraud and embezzlement. The story made headlines throughout the county, with particular focus on how she'd used a charity event to steal money from donors while claiming to help children. The impact on the community was profound. The HOA board voted to dissolve the organization entirely, returning control of neighborhood issues to individual property owners and the county government. Several other regional HOAs requested audits of their finances, concerned that similar fraud might be occurring in their communities. For me, the resolution brought more than just personal satisfaction. During my federal career, I'd often felt frustrated by jurisdictional limitations and bureaucratic obstacles that allowed criminals to escape consequences. Watching Melody's complete downfall, knowing that justice was being served both legally and socially, reminded me why I'd chosen law enforcement as a career in the first place. 3 months later, I received a letter from the district attorney's office informing me that Melody Thornfield had accepted a plea agreement that included restitution to all fraud victims and a 5-year prison sentence. The letter also mentioned that several other HOA officials in different counties had been arrested on similar charges, suggesting that Melody's case had triggered a broader investigation into homeowner association fraud. Standing on my front porch, looking out over the ranch my grandfather had built and my father had preserved, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond personal vindication. The land was quiet again, home to cattle and horses, rather than unauthorized galas and fraudulent charity events. The peace I'd sought when I retired from federal service had been restored, protected by the same investigative skills that had defined my career. Sometimes justice comes through complex legal processes and lengthy investigations, but sometimes it comes from simply standing your ground when someone tries to take what's yours, and letting their own criminal behavior provide the evidence needed to stop them. Melody Thornfield learned the hard way that some people can't be intimidated, deceived, or pushed around, especially when those people have spent their careers putting criminals behind bars. The ranch remains in my family, a peaceful sanctuary where the only events are the ones I choose to host, and somewhere in a state correctional facility, a former HOA president is learning that fraud has consequences no matter how noble the claimed intentions might be. 6 months after Melody's sentencing, I thought the saga was finally behind me. The ranch had returned to its peaceful rhythm. The community had adapted to life without an authoritarian HOA, and I'd settled back into the quiet retirement I'd originally sought. That's when Detective Chen called with news that would pull me back into the world of HOA fraud investigation. "Jack, we've got a situation developing in Pine Valley, about 2 hours north of you," she said. "Another HOA president is running a similar scheme to what Melody was doing, but this one's even more sophisticated. The FBI has requested consultation from someone with your background, and specifically, someone who's dealt with this type of fraud before." The request wasn't entirely surprising. Word had spread through law enforcement circles about the Thornfield case, particularly the methods she'd used to maintain her deception and the warning signs that had been overlooked by the community. Several federal agencies had expressed interest in developing training materials for investigating HOA-related fraud. Using our case as a primary example, what makes this one more sophisticated, I asked, already knowing I'd probably agree to help. The Pine Valley president, a woman named Victoria Ashford, has been operating for 3 years without detection. Detective Chen explained. She's got fake charities, shell companies, forged government partnerships, and what appears to be a network of accomplices in multiple counties. The financial damage is estimated at over $2 million. The scope was staggering compared to Melody's relatively simple scheme. While Melody had been essentially a solo operator whose crimes were driven by ego and desperation, Victoria Ashford sounded like someone running a sophisticated criminal enterprise that used HOA authority as cover for large-scale fraud. The Pine Valley residents have been dealing with increasingly authoritarian rules and mysterious fee increases. Detective Chen continued, but Ashford has been clever about providing just enough legitimate community improvements to make people think their money is being well spent. She's also got connections with local government officials that have made residents afraid to complain. The political protection angle was something we hadn't encountered with Melody, who had operated primarily through deception rather than actual corruption. Victoria Ashford seemed to understand that maintaining the appearance of legitimacy required more than just fake paperwork. It required compromised officials who would actively protect her scheme. 3 days later, I found myself driving north toward Pine Valley, carrying a briefcase full of analysis documents from the Thornfield case, and a growing sense that this investigation would be far more complex than anything I dealt with during my ATF career. The landscape changed from open ranch country to dense pine forests as I approached the mountain community that had become the center of what federal investigators were calling the largest HOA fraud case in state history. Pine Valley was immediately recognizable as an affluent community, with manicured entrance gates, professionally maintained landscaping, and the kind of expensive infrastructure that suggested residents paid substantial HOA fees. But there was something unsettling about the perfection. Every house looked exactly the same. Every yard was maintained to identical standards, and the few residents I saw moved with the nervous energy of people living under constant scrutiny. My meeting with FBI Special Agent Rebecca Martinez took place at a small conference room in the county courthouse. Away from potential surveillance by Ashford's network, the evidence laid out on the conference table was overwhelming in its scope and sophistication. Ashford has been collecting additional fees for everything from security upgrades to environmental assessments, Agent Martinez explained, pointing to a complex chart showing money flows between various accounts. But the security company is owned by her brother-in-law. The environmental consulting firm is operated by her college roommate, and the construction contracts all go to companies that exist only on paper. The level of coordination suggested that Victoria Ashford had been planning this scheme for years before implementing it, carefully building a network of accomplices and shell companies that could provide the appearance of legitimate business activity while funneling money into accounts she controlled. "What's her background?" I asked, studying photographs of a woman who looked nothing like the desperate, grandiose Melody Thornfield. Victoria Ashford appeared professional and competent, with the kind of corporate polish that would make residents trust her with their community's finances. Former corporate finance manager, laid off during the 2019 downsizing at Mountain States Insurance, Agent Martinez replied, moved to Pine Valley and got elected HOA president within 6 months. She immediately began implementing what she called professional management standards that gave her unprecedented control over community finances. The pattern was familiar from my federal cases. Someone with legitimate professional skills who had experienced career setbacks and decided to use their expertise for criminal purposes. Unlike Melody's amateur hour fraud, Victoria Ashford had the knowledge and connections to build a sustainable criminal enterprise. The residents are scared? Agent Martinez continued. Ashford has been using selective enforcement of community rules to punish anyone who questions her decisions. She's also been spreading rumors about people who oppose her, destroying their reputations within the community. Several families have moved away rather than continue fighting her. The psychological control aspect elevated this case beyond simple fraud into something approaching organized racketeering. Victoria Ashford had created a system where stealing from residents was protected by fear, manipulation, and the legitimate authority of her elected position. Over the following weeks, I worked with the federal task force to analyze Ashford's methods and identify vulnerabilities in her operation. The experience reminded me why I'd originally been drawn to law enforcement: the satisfaction of using investigative skills to protect innocent people from sophisticated criminals who believed they were too smart to be caught. The Pine Valley case would eventually result in 14 arrests, including 3 county officials who had been receiving kickbacks for providing regulatory protection to Ashford's schemes. The investigation also led to changes in state law, requiring independent audits of HOA finances and establishing criminal penalties specifically for abuse of homeowner association authority. But for me, the most satisfying outcome was watching the Pine Valley community transform from a place of fear and suspicion back into a neighborhood where people could live without worrying about authoritarian harassment disguised as community improvement. It was exactly the kind of restoration of peace and justice that had originally motivated me to become a federal agent. And it reminded me that retirement didn't have to mean abandoning the fight against those who prey on their neighbors. Standing on my ranch porch that evening, looking out over land that would never again be threatened by fraudulent HOA schemes. I realized that sometimes the most important cases are the ones that hit closest to home. The skills I developed during 20 years of federal service had found new purpose in protecting communities from a type of criminal that most law enforcement agencies were just beginning to understand: